promoting dialogue.
It's midday in Dakar. Good afternoon and many thanks for staying tuned to West Africa Democracy Radio, broadcasting on 94.9 FM and around the world on wadr.org. Welcome to NEWSLINK. Here are the top stories. Civil society group M62 in Niger announced a series of activities including protests against the presence of foreign forces in the country. The Gambian government engages the IMF over the country's diagnostic on corruption.
We have engaged the IMF to do a country diagnostic study that will identify vulnerabilities to corruption and malgovernance.
294 Senegalese migrants repatriated from Morocco to arrive in St. Louis today. And BRICS Summit opens for 30 heads of state to discuss business opportunities in South Africa.
But the new wave of protectionism and subsequent impact of unilateral measures that are incompatible with WTO rules undermine the global economic growth and development.
Please stay tuned for details of these stories and more.
Here is Imo Edit with NEWSLINK.
Many thanks for joining us and a warm welcome to our listeners in the Gambia, Liberia and in Ghana. Well, 12 Nigerian soldiers were killed in an ambush by suspected jihadists in a counter-operation in the Telaberi region southwest of the country. The announcement was made on Tuesday by the state television, Tele Sahel. According to the same sources, the intervention took place in an area known to be occupied by Sahelian jihadists affiliated with Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State group. Ogabirika reports.
A report by Tele Sahel specified that the attack, which occurred on Sunday in the town of Ansuru, targeted a mission of the National Guard's anti-jihadist operation. It said 12 members of the paramilitary corps of Niger's armed forces were killed in the incident. However, heavy losses were inflicted on the enemy side in a counter-offensive against the insurgents. The Tilaberi region, located in the tri-border area that includes Niger, Burkina Faso and Mali, has been regularly targeted by armed groups despite the massive deployment of anti-jihadist forces to the troubled zone. On August 15, a detachment of Nigerian Special Forces was waylaid on the national road linking the localities of Boni and Torodi, about 60 kilometers west of Niamey towards the border with Burkina Faso. According to a provisional report from the Ministry of Defense, at least 17 soldiers were killed and 20 others injured. Niger's National Guard is paying the heaviest price in the assaults launched in recent weeks by insurgents since the combat units usually deployed on the ground were recalled to Niamey in the event that regional armed forces intervene to restore constitutional order as stated by the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS.
Ogabirika found that report. Meanwhile, the coordinator of the anti-force movement in Niger, known as M62, made his first public appearance on Tuesday, several days after his unexpected release from prison. Abdoulaye said during the press briefing in Niamey, the capital once again reaffirmed the position of the civil society organization to continuously fight against the presence of foreign forces in the country. For the activists, the fight will also continue for a reduction in the price of diesel at the gas station. During the briefing, which was the first since his release from prison by the junta, the M62 coordinator recalled the conditions of his detention in the Kolo High Security Facility. Abdullah said to the coordinator of M62 a series of action, according to him, will be undertaken in the coming days, including awareness campaigns for the departure of foreign forces from Niger. Now away from Niger, a Chadian rebel group has threatened to stand up to the country's military-led government in Chad after days. Another rebel group, the Front for Change and Concord in Chad FACT, announced an end to a ceasefire declared in 2021. The rebel group, known as the Popular Front for Recovery, vowed to use all necessary means to restore democracy in the North Central African nation and called on all patriotic forces to unite for a national uprising. James Japon tells us more.
Tensions have flared again on Chad's northern border with Libya, where fighting between rebels and the army subsided after President Idris Deby was killed on the battlefield in 2021. His son, Muhammad Idris Deby, seized power after his father's death and sought to restore peace, pardoning hundreds of imprisoned rebels and encouraging groups to take part in peace talks. Recall, more than 30 rebel and opposition factions signed a peace pact with Chad's transition authorities in Doha last year, although the Libya-based Front for Change and Concord, FACT, refused to take part. On Saturday, FACT accused authorities of bombing one of its bases earlier that week and ended the ceasefire it declared in 2021. Deby responded on Sunday saying the army attacked after FACT rebels crossed into Chadian authority. He said he would remain at the front line for a week to oversee operations and warned FACT he would personally lead a battle against them if they did not put down arms. An eruption of fighting in Chad could destabilize a long-time Western ally against militants waging an insurgency across the Sahel region. Attempts to curb the jihadists have been derailed by a string of coups in West and Central Africa, including a military takeover in Niger last month.
James, the Japan filed a report and to some electoral matters now. Cote d'Ivoire's Independent Electoral Commission, CEI, has delivered electoral documents including specimen ballot papers and posters to each candidate list for the regional and municipal councillors' elections on September 2. The presentation on Tuesday at the Election House headquarters in Abidjan 2 Plateau is in accordance with the requirements of the Electoral Code. For more details, here is Matasi.
The president of the Independent Electoral Commission, Ibrahim Koulibaly-Kubier, made the presentation to 7 candidates. The verification that began on Tuesday, August 22nd, ends today, August 23rd, as announced by the CEI. Koulibaly-Kubier took the opportunity to recall the basis of this discount provided for by the legislature, stating that the election is not a game of chance, nor is it a joke, but about people's lives. He insists that voters must be able to make informed choices, a mission that should be carried out by the candidates during the period before the elections while respecting all campaign rules. According to the president of the electoral umpire, these electoral documents must therefore serve to make the candidate visible and also facilitate the voter's choice. The Independent Electoral Commission, CEI, will present 1,000 specimen ballot papers and 300 posters to a total of 749 for the municipal elections and 93 lists of candidates for the regional elections. The twin elections are scheduled to hold on September 2nd, to be followed by the senatorial election on September 16th. Both elections are seen as litmus tests for the ruling government in the 2025 presidential vote.
Matase reporting there.
More stories coming up on West Africa Democracy Radio. NewsLink continues.
All right, let's take you down to the Gambia where we have a couple of stories. First of all, the government has engaged the International Monetary Fund, IMF, to conduct a country diagnostic study to identify vulnerabilities to corruption and poor governance. The move, which authorities say is part of the governance reform agenda, comes days after President Adama Barrow suspended all foreign travel for all government officials, including himself. WDL Sankli Duncan Banjul has more.
The Gambia government, in the past 72 hours, made some interesting revelations, some of which, by and large, were widely applauded by the population. The latest of these revelations were made by the country's Minister of Finance and Economic Affairs, Sidi Keita. The minister, during an interview with a local radio in Banjul on Tuesday, said the government has engaged IMF with a view to unraveling corruption in the public sector.
We have engaged the IMF to do a country diagnostic study that will identify vulnerabilities to corruption and malgovernance and public expenditure improvement.
This comes against the backdrop of the recent travel ban declared by President Adama Barrow for all government officials for the rest of the fiscal year 2023. The ban, which according to the presidency aims at curbing government expenditure, indicates some exemptions such as travels to statutory meetings where the Gambia's participation is mandatory and foreign trips fully funded by external sources. These exemptions are, however, subject to the prior approval of the president or an authorized official. Highlighting the significance of the measure, the finance minister revealed that the travel ban is not only limited to core government institutions.
This is to the entire public funds. Any institution that is using public funds, this moratorium decision is binding on you. It's for the entire economy wherever public resources are being utilized.
The Barrow-led government is perceived to be doing very little in the fight against corruption, as the anti-corruption bill drags its feet in the National Assembly without any substantial progress on its enactment. Involving the International Monetary Fund, according to political commentators, is a step in the right direction. For NEWSLINK and West Africa Democracy Radio, I am Sankula Janko reporting from Banjul.
We remain in the Gambia as the expansion works of the Banjul Seaport and Sanyang Deep Seaport in the country's southern coastline have received approval. The expansion project is in response to the increasing need to improve the handling capacity of the country's only seaport and decongest terminals, which should be concluded within 24 months. The Gambia Port Authority, GPA, is embarking on the project under a public-private partnership PPP with Al Bayrak and Negma Consortium of Turkey, but serving as guarantors and shareholders in the Special Purpose Vehicle SPV. The PPP arrangement is expected to address the need for sustainable management and operations of the port facilities, given the climate risk associated with rising sea levels, perennial dredging, and the limited capacity for expansion and congestion in the capital city. Ibrahim Masila is the Minister of Transport, Works and Infrastructure.
Port of Banjul has lived its usefulness in terms of spending on the facilities and the infrastructure because of the size and the space, and also the environmental issues. Now that this bold decision has been taken by the government of the Gambia to a much bigger space and then, access a deep sea, I think this is a very good initiative. It's a very innovative, idea, but it's also a bold move because it will entail a lot, and this will also bring in the much needed investment in the southern belt of the country, in the West Coast region, because of course roads will be expanded. I mean, more services will come. A lot of areas that are out of, the services, for example, electricity and water and even telecoms, will now, of course, have faster broadband facilities, much stable electricity, and employment will be generated because this region is also beset with this backway syndrome, where the young people take the risk to leave the country to go, to Europe through the back way. A lot of those young people will now have the opportunity to be employed.
Ibrahim Masila is the Minister of Transport, Works and Infrastructure in the Gambia. A total of 294 Senegalese migrants recently rescued by the Royal Moroccan Navy left Dakar early Tuesday afternoon and will return to Senegal on Wednesday. According to the state news agency, 2 women and a dozen minors are part of the convoy, which should arrive in St. Louis this afternoon. Authorities say about 30 candidates for immigration from Fastboy in the HS region could not be part of this group of returnees due to logistical problems. We head now to Liberia, where stakeholders have underscored the need for the establishment of a trust fund to take care of victims of sexual exploitation and abuse. But it should be noted that the victims in this instance are those abused by uniformed personnel of the United Nations once deployed to the country. Liberian Foreign Minister D. Maxwell Sa-Kemaya, adding his voice to the call, informed that more than 6,000 children fathered by soldiers in the West African Peacekeeping Mission came to Liberia in 1990 and left 8 years later. WDL's Monrovia correspondent Darlington Popper reports.
According to Foreign Minister Kimbeyan, setting up the trust fund will enable countries like Liberia, which empathize with the victims, to contribute at the level of the United Nations. Kimbeyan disclosed this while receiving Jean Conoros, the United Nations Assistant Secretary General for Victims' Rights Advocates at the Foreign Ministry Office.
Taking a cue from the 2007 resolution, it is important that the UN, using that resolution, holds countries accountable to hold their citizens who were uniformed personnel accountable in terms of the decisions that the UNGA, the General Assembly, there were the authority is outside of the Security Council.
For her part, Konora said the Office of the Victims' Rights Advocate is to support victims of sexual exploitation and abuse who have children that were born of misconduct of troops that were serving under the United Nations flag in Liberia.
The first is to support victims of sexual exploitation and abuse who have children who were born as a result of the misconduct of troops serving under the United Nations flag from Nigeria in the time of UNMIL. So we're here to support the initiatives, which is to seek to resolve some of these cases through DNA analysis of samples taken from the children and samples taken from the putative.
For now, the mothers of those children left behind in Liberia can only hope the UN speeds up the exercise to assist the over 6,000 children. For NEWSLINK on West Africa Democracy Radio, I'm Darlington Popa in Monrovia.
You're listening to NEWSLINK on West Africa Democracy Radio 94.9 FM Dakar. Here is a reminder of our top stories. Civil society group M62 in Niger announces a series of activities, including protests in the coming days against the presence of foreign forces in the country. The Gambian government engages the IMF over the country's diagnostic on corruption. 294 Senegalese migrants repatriated from Morocco to arrive in Saint Louis today. And still ahead, BRICS Summit opens for 30 heads of state to discuss business opportunities in South Africa. We also have the guest interview segment, newspaper review, and sports update. Please stay with us.
West Africa Democracy Radio. It's you speaking.
Don't forget, we are streaming live on wadr.org. Elsewhere, leaders from South Africa, Russia, Brazil, India, and China is taking part in the international program of the 15th BRICS Summit in South Africa's Johannesburg. The financial summit opened on Tuesday and ends tomorrow, August 24. Global geopolitics, economic issues, trade and infrastructure, development, business opportunities, and the bloc's potential expansion are expected to be discussed during the meeting, among other topics. Well, here is a speech by South African President Cyril Ramaphosa.
As we celebrate the 15th anniversary of BRICS, trade between BRICS countries totaled some $162 billion last year. Foreign investment has played an important role in the growth of BRICS economies. Total annual foreign direct investment into BRICS countries is 4 times greater than it was 20 years ago. However, the new wave of protectionism and subsequent impact of unilateral measures that are incompatible with WTO rules undermine the global economic growth and development. We therefore need to reaffirm our position that economic growth must be underpinned by transparency, by inclusiveness. It must be compatible with a multilateral trading system that supports a developmental agenda, the type of developmental agenda that the 5 countries that are members of BRICS have embraced right from the onset. We require a fundamental reform of the global financial institutions so that they can be more agile and responsive to the challenges facing developing economies.
South Africa's president there, Cyril Ramaphosa, speaking. Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin took multiple shots at the West on the opening day using a pre-recorded speech that was aired on giant screens to rail at what he called illegitimate sanctions on his country and threatened to cut off Ukraine's grain export permanently. Putin, the subject of an international criminal court arrest warrant related to the war in Ukraine, did not travel to Johannesburg for the summit of the BRICS group of emerging economies. Instead, he plans to participate remotely in the 3-day meeting of the bloc that encompasses Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa.
This is the newspaper review. Stay on top of the news. Get the most important stories with added insight and concise review.
This is the newspaper review.
All right, let's head back to the Gambia for the press review with Sankle Janko.
Hello and welcome to this edition of the Press Review. Let's begin today's Press Review with the Point newspaper. And the Point newspaper's lead story today reads, BCC failure to heed exposes GPPA's weakness. Foreign travel ban covers all public institutions, according to the finance minister. Recently, President Barrow signed an executive order banning all foreign travels for government officials. And the finance minister further explains that it is not limited to only the government institutions, but it covers all public institutions where public funds are being used. Unidentified corpse found at Janjambure River. That is another story. This other one reads, Barrow to grace Janjambure's bicentenary anniversary. GAMTUB supports call for diplomacy in Niger. Let's move on to the Foreign newspaper. The Foreign's lead story reads, petrol inaccessible to buyers. That's the lead story on the Foreign newspaper. This other one reads, ECOWAS envoy says discussions with Niger junta productive. Commercial taxi drivers abandon Bundung Highway. I can tell that this road is so dilapidated that commuters struggle before they can get a vehicle to their various destinations. This one talks about Niger, and it reads, on Niger tomorrow, ECOWAS Parliament insists on diplomatic solution. And still on Niger, this other one reads, AUP's Security Council urges Niger military junta to immediately return to barracks. Let's move on to the final newspaper for today, and that is the Standard newspaper. The Standard newspaper's lead story reads, government launches over $1 billion project to protect fisheries sector from climate change. The photo of fisheries minister, that is Musa Drame, right on the front page. Man in court for allegedly forging letters from OP. This other story reads, government should adopt National Assembly's vehicle policy for ministers. Recently, National Assembly where members were handed over their vehicles. That was a bit controversial because so many Gambians thought it was too expensive to buy a vehicle for $3 million. But this National Assembly member Jallo says, in fact, other government institutions should actually adopt this vehicle policy. And talking about these controversial National Assembly's vehicles, said Matijau defends National Assembly members' vehicles. Said Matijau is a renowned human rights activist, and he's usually very critical of the government. But he has come out to defend this vehicle policy. And the final story for today's edition of the press review reads, Army rebukes former commanders' disappointing comments. I'm afraid these are the major stories making headlines on the Gambian dailies. It's back to you in the studio.
Indeed, many thanks, Uncle Janko, there with the press review.
Politics, analysis on major news, social matters, and all. This is A Guest.
In our guest interview segment this afternoon, Ghanaian writer, art historian and filmmaker Nana Ofori-Attah has raised concern about the unequal representation of women in Ghanaian and, by extension, African history. According to Ms. Ayim, this further suppresses African heritage and arts which has been exploited for many years to the detriment of the continent. Nana Ayim made these remarks during the ongoing Open Society Foundation's global initiative for the Restitution for African Cultural Heritage Summit, which continues today in Accra, the Ghanaian capital. The summit is aimed at bringing together ideas to build a strong sense of awareness of the need to restitution of the African identity, which can serve as a key ingredient towards reclaiming Africa's lost identity, culture, and artifacts. Speaking to WDR's Atevin Lawson, now Ofori-Attah bemoaned the lack of representation and reorganization of African history in the liberation and development of the continent.
I don't think there's one particular way that they're depicted, but what I can say is that there's a paucity or a dearth or a lack of representation. as compared to the men. I mean, we see this in global history, that the history as we know it from the West is often a history of men, history of power, wars, politics, etc. And as we know it from the West, it is a history of men. But what's different in the Ghanaian context is that before the encounter with colonialism, women were as present within political spheres, etc., as men. The Queen Mother would sit on the right-hand side of the king. But what happened when colonial powers came into being was when they wrote new constitutions, they did not include the Queen Mother, for example, within the constitution. So the Queen Mother had to almost be like an extra to the king, whereas within traditional politics, she was enshrined as an equal power bearer. And so even though we're still, a lot of our groups or communities are still matrilineal, i.e. the power still goes through the line of the women, you won't see us as present in history books. When we celebrate national days, for example, we celebrate the Big Six, who are all 6 men. We celebrate our founder, Kwame Nkrumah. There's very little celebration of the women who went about creating our nation. Very little celebration of the women who went about creating our communities. And so I would say that there's definitely a need for equalization.
I was Ghanaian writer, art historian, and filmmaker Nana Oferiota speaking there. And in sport brief, Ivorian spring sensation Talu has missed out on women's 100-meter medal at the World Championship in Budapest on Tuesday. The former African Liu finished 4th in the 100-meter race behind Sally Ann, Fraser Price Jackson and winner Sha'Carri Richardson of USA in a tightly contested race. Meanwhile, Kenya's Faith Kipyegon claimed a 3rd World Championship gold after winning the women's 100 and 1,500 meters final at the ongoing Athletic World Championship in Budapest on Tuesday. The long-distance expert claimed the gold medal having completed the race at 3 hours, 54 minutes and 87 seconds. And we've come to the end of this edition of NewsLink from West Africa Democracy Radio, broadcasting from Dakar, Senegal. Thank you for listening, and many thanks to our listeners in the Gambia via Hot 104.3 FM and Numi FM, 94.0 Banjul in Liberia via Alternative Youth Radio, 98.9 FM Lofa County. We also thank our listeners in Ghana on Radio Pod 95.1 Savannah region and on Royals FM 104.7 Wenchi. Ian William has been on the console, and many thanks to the technical team. Let's continue the conversation on X, formerly Twitter, Instagram at WDR News, and Facebook, West Africa Democracy Radio, English Service. Coming up at the bottom of the hour is Agenda Program 50/50. I am Imo Edet. Good afternoon.
News, talk, music. Get it all 24 hours on West Africa Democracy Radio. 94.9 FM Dakar.